Thanks a lot indeed joining us for this interview amid your busy days, and I do appreciate that, Mr. John Qazvinian. First of all, I want to know how can we introduce you, first of all, if you introduce yourself and your job title and everything.
Sure, I'm a historian of US-Iran relations.
Great. In your book, you trace US-Iran relations back to the 18th century, describing an early period of mutual curiosity. What were the key turning points that shifted this relationship from fascination to hostility, and how do they inform the tensions we see today?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that really came out of the research for this book is a realization that both of these countries had a very warm fascination and admiration for each other, but also a kind of idealization, sort of, in some ways, a kind of unrealistic idealization that they had of each other in both directions. For the Americans, Iran, from the 18th century right up until 1979, was this exotic Eastern kingdom that was further east than the things that they found threatening. So in the 18th century, the threat was the Ottoman Empire. But to the east of the Ottoman Empire was the Persian Empire, and it was the enemy of my enemy. The Ottoman Empire, of course, was the threat to Christian Europe, and in the 1720s, when some of the first North American newspapers first started writing about Iran, the Ottoman Empire was seen as the great threat to Christian civilization, and those American colonial settlers saw themselves as an extension of that European civilization. So they liked the Persians, they liked the Iranians, and that idealized notion, in some ways, was inherited from their understanding of the Bible and ancient history as well. They had this idealized sense of Persians in the Bible, from Cyrus and the three magi, the so-called the Mulk, right, the sort of Zoroastrian priests that bring the wise men from the east, that bring the news of the birth of the baby Jesus. But also, some of the founding fathers of the United States, people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and others, were familiar with ancient Persian history to some degree, and had this idealized notion of this ancient Persian empire as well. So that lingered for at least a couple of hundred years and it really never went away fully until 1979. Even in the 1970s, Iran was always described, as less threatening, less evil than the Arab world, for example, that was just to its west. All of that changed with the revolution. In the other direction, the Iranians had this idealized view of Americans as being kind of like further west than Europe. They were seen as an extension of European civilization, and less imperialistic, less greedy, less cynical, more idealistic, more understanding of Iran's aspirations as a weakening nation in the face of European imperialism. So that came a little bit later. That came from around the 1850s and 60s. But you really see that in a lot of the first newspapers that were published in Iran, this idealized view of the United States as a young country, a 100-year-old country that had fought a revolution to free itself from British imperialism. And as Iran began to feel more and more frustrated by British and Russian imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially as you started to get this nationalist consciousness in Iran in the early 20th century, the United States became even more idealized in some ways. As a kind of antidote to that. Everything that Iranians liked about the West, its technological advancement, its democratic traditions, its constitutionalism, its success and economic prosperity, but without the kind of political imperialism of the British and Russian empires. So that all ended around 1953. Right up until the end, even Mossadegh still had this very idealized notion of the United States. 3 weeks before he was overthrown, he wrote a letter to Eisenhower asking him for help against the British and their sanctions and their embargoes, not knowing that Eisenhower had already made the decision to overthrow him. That, to me, is one of the greatest testaments to just how deeply, right up until the end, Iranians of a particular nationalist persuasion believed in this idea of American respect for sovereignty and weaker, smaller countries and so on. All of that changed after 1953. So that in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Iranians began to associate the United States with support for the Shah and for his increasingly repressive regime. At the same time that the United States internationally was also becoming less popular in the developing world and the third world for its activities in Vietnam and elsewhere. So all of that began to change for Iranians in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and for Americans up to 1979.
Great. Given that political and historical background in our mind, I want to shift to current days. The US strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan on June 21st marked a significant escalation, with Iran retaliating against US forces in Qatar. How do you interpret these actions in the context of the historical US-Iran dynamic you have studied and you have mentioned right now?
Yeah, obviously it's the horror scenario that most of us have been dreading. This idea of full-scale military hostilities between the United States and Iran. The two countries did exchange military hostilities in the late 1980s, of course, in the so-called tanker war, but that was on a much smaller scale. Nobody ever dropped a bomb on the other country's sovereign territory. That is a red line that I think a lot of us never imagined would even be crossed. To be honest, I didn't expect that. At any point in the last 25 years. I always thought that a lot of the American rhetoric about Iran and keeping all options on the table was largely a tactical one. I actually believe it was. I think we live in just a fundamentally different world now with Donald Trump as president. So what I think is interesting, though, is still there are certain patterns that are holding. Still, the most interesting one for me is that still the two countries pull back from the brink of absolute all-out war. Now, that may change. I could be proved wrong even by the time people watch this video. I don't know. As we are recording this, there seems to be some quiet. All is quiet on the Iranian front, I think, for now. The ceasefire is holding. Donald Trump has made it clear that those bombs were kind of the end of it, although he's also made it clear that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, which is sort of, I guess, his way of keeping things open. The Iranians clearly responded in a way that was measured and calculated to not escalate by signaling ahead of time their intentions, making sure there were no civilian casualties. There were no casualties, actually. That all says a lot. Once again, you have these two countries that don't really want to go to full-scale war with each other.
I want to know about Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's stances that has expressed openness to diplomacy but insists on Iran's right to uranium enrichment as a bold red line. How does this stance align with historical Iranian position on its nuclear program, as far as you have this historical and political background in your mind and you have studied it carefully in your book?
It's a tremendous amount of consistency in Iran's position on the nuclear program, dating from the Shah's regime in the 1970s until today. And in fact, I will even say this with great confidence. For people who want to talk about regime change, any Iranian regime that replaces this one will still want a nuclear program. There's no question in my mind about that. The only way that is going to change is either you create, if you want an Iran that doesn't have a nuclear program of any kind, that is zero enrichment, zero nuclear program, the only way that's going to happen, there are only two ways that can happen. One is that you provoke so much chaos and actual civil war, probably to that degree in Iran, a sort of Syria type of scenario, where Iran is just in no position to be focused on its nuclear program, or you manage somehow to get a regime that is completely compliant and really overtly a puppet state of the West. That second scenario seems extremely unlikely to me. The first scenario, I wish I could say it's extremely unlikely, but I don't think it's completely inconceivable, sadly, with I think the people that are making the decisions in the United States and in Israel and elsewhere. I think they would not be opposed to something like that. And I think Iranians have to be very careful, and I hope they will be. But the fact is that for Iran, this is a country that signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, the day it opened for signatures. And as a member state of the NPT, Iran feels that it is technically and legally correct on this point, that it has a right to enrich uranium on its soil as long as it is for peaceful purposes. Now, that second part is where the debate comes in. As long as it is for peaceful purposes, and there's ambiguity, of course, in Iran's nuclear program, and distrust, of course, because of Iran's relationship with a lot of outside powers. But for Iran, they have dug into this position, and they're not going to back down on this position. They're not going to accept any kind of settlement that negates this right, unless there is some kind of very creative consortium agreement that has been floated, the kind that Witkoff and others were talking about before all of this hostilities started. That idea has been around since the 1970s. It was floated by the Ford administration in 1976. It was floated by Ahmadinejad in 2006. So yeah, that is a potential off-ramp, but that requires some trust, some negotiations, some goodwill, which is in very short supply right now.
President Trump has claimed that U.S. strikes obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities, yet intelligence reports suggest the setback was only a few months. Given your research, how significant is the nuclear issue in driving U.S.-Iran relations and tensions, and what are the risks of this narrative?
We've seen conflicted intelligence reports, frankly, about just how far Iran's nuclear program has been set back. I think we need some more time, actually, to get better intelligence and to really know. And of course, there's a certain psychological war as well. So, what statements that are made by both governments have to be taken with a grain of salt, because we don't know to what extent it's part of a kind of game as well. The nuclear issue is extremely important to U.S.-Iran relations and to their hostilities, but I have always believed that it is, in isolation, it is actually relatively meaningless, that there is a bigger context, that you cannot really solve the nuclear issue in an absence of serious atmosphere of serious trust and goodwill. And we saw that because it didn't work. Obama did a very, very good deal, very detailed, very exhaustive, very well thought out, very comprehensive deal with Iran. And it didn't hold up because the two countries do not have the kind of political relationship that will make that hold up. So to me, the nuclear thing is, I've always felt it was a bit of a distraction, to be honest.
In your book, when you were talking about Netanyahu's strategies against Iran, you mentioned that the strategy of Netanyahu is like a weapon that he doesn't want to trigger. It means that Netanyahu wants to show that he wants to attack Iran in order to tantalize European countries to get more concessions and these kind of things. But today, we see that Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear and military targets, followed by US involvement, has raised fears of a broader regional war. How do you see Israel's actions fitting into the historical US, Iran, Israel triangle that you explore in your book?
Yeah, that analysis belonged to 2009, 2010, 2011, 12, 13. I absolutely stand by that analysis, but things have changed. That was a different time. That was a time when we had a Democratic president, Obama, who was absolutely committed to the idea of rapprochement with Iran. And so Israel used the best methods that it had at its disposal, which was not to actually go to war, but to keep that as a constant, kind of possibility on the sidelines, to be able to put pressure on the Obama administration not to do the thing that Israel really didn't want, which was a better relationship between the United States and Iran. That is now fundamentally not on the table, and it hasn't been for several years now. I mean, at least since the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and even including the Biden administration. So really, for the last 8-9 years, there's been no serious possibility no serious talk in Washington of like improving relations with Iran. In fact, even in 2015, by the time the JCPOA was finished, Obama was clearly no longer had the appetite for that same kind of rapprochement. So the Israeli tactics they worked very well. They did their job. So Israel hasn't needed to do that as much. In fact, it has not threatened war very much with Iran from 2016 up until recently, much less than it was then, right? Which is interesting, right? At the time when Obama was trying to do kind of create a new reset with Iran, that's when Israel was making all that noise about the possibility of war. Once the possibility of kind of improved U.S.-Iran relations was kind of more or less off the table, Israel actually quieted down quite a bit about sort of military threats. Recently, of course, things have changed dramatically. I mean, in the last almost 2 years now since the Hamas attack on Israel in October of 2023. I mean, Netanyahu himself, who was very war averse, has changed. He was often seen as someone who talked a big game but didn't actually go to war. Whose bark was worse than his bite. That has clearly changed. He has now started multiple wars across the entire Middle East. And he's done that because he thinks, I mean, to some extent, it was a reaction to almost a sort of opportunity that was presented by the Hamas attacks to kind of annihilate Hamas and to fundamentally wipe out the Palestinians from Gaza and possibly the West Bank, which I think is something that he and his coalition would like anyway. And then once he was locked into that war, it had a self-perpetuating logic where he has to continue it because he has his own, domestic legal issues as well, and so on. So that's and then he has a Donald Trump presidency as well since the beginning of this year, where he has an American president who's going to look the other way, and that was frankly the true under Biden as well. Obama might have put some pressure on Israel, but those days are over. So I think Israel's been doing whatever it can get away with, and I think that's why things have changed. And it sees an opportunity to provoke a war with Iran that maybe even the U.S. can get involved with, which of course is exactly what happened, and perhaps weaken or even destroy the Islamic Republic completely, which is a huge opportunity for Netanyahu. So today is very different from 2010. Right? Basically, it's the short answer.
Thank you. And I want to take a look at the Arab states in the Persian Gulf and the southern part of the Persian Gulf. Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pursued diplomatic tracks with Iran to reduce tensions. Yet they also condemn Israeli actions. How do you assess the role of Arab diplomacy in potentially mediating US-Iran conflicts?
Yeah, the role of the Gulf Arab states has changed quite a bit over the years, the last few years as well. They have gone from wanting to create some sort of improved relationship and peace accords with Israel to and isolating Iran to a very much more nuanced position. I think the Saudis would still like some kind of sort of grand bargain with Israel, but obviously that's not on the table right now, and that is going to have to wait. And in the interim, it's very obvious that the political center of gravity in the Middle East is not with Israel right now in terms of popularity, in terms of the opinion of Arab publics. I think largely speaking, Arab publics are more sympathetic to Iran and to its people than they have been at any time, probably since the Hezbollah war in 2006. Right? For a long time, Iran has been unpopular in the region for its support for the Assad regime and so on. But I think that has changed a little bit in recent weeks. There's a sense of probably some solidarity from Houthis in Yemen to Iran to Palestinians in Gaza. I mean, it's a different landscape.
Yeah. And you have described Trump's approach as transactional, aiming for better nuclear deal with the JCPOA. Given the recent military escalation, what historical parallels you can draw to assess whether Trump's strategy could lead to a breakthrough or a further conflict?
I think deep down, I could be wrong. I have no idea. But I think deep down, Trump would love to do a deal with Iran that fundamentally resets U.S.-Iran relations and allows American companies to invest in Iran and vice versa, and taps into the extraordinary potential that we all know Iran has with its enormous population and its very educated public and all those things, which I don't need to tell you or your viewers. I think Trump would love that. But I think he's also running up against some of the realities of power in the United States and the ways that foreign policy is done in the United States. But what is interesting is that Trump's support base is very divided. He has two very different types of supporters. Of course, he has the traditional Republican Party, hawkish, neoconservative, pro-Israeli kind of community represented by people like Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, and others in his orbit. These are represented, by a lot of his, within his administration by people like Tulsi Gabbard, the National Security Advisor, but also with very influential media supporters like Tucker Carlson, right? So right now he's leaning towards the traditional establishment, policy with dropping bombs on Iran. But he also turned around a day or two later and was visibly and vocally angry with Israel, right? Saying that he was really unhappy with them for breaking the ceasefire, and I think he probably is. So I think he would really like to see this end, so he can move on to some kind of much more durable deal with Iran. I think in his mind, what he wants is to be able to say we have absolutely 100% prevented Iran from having a nuclear weapon, and so Israel's happy, and now we are actually moving on to a new relationship with Iran, and Iran can, as he puts it, have a country. It can be a successful country.
What lessons from the history of US-Iran relations, as detailed in your book, would you recommend to policymakers in both countries to avoid a return to all-out war and foster?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not in the business of giving advice to governments, but I think the United States foreign policy community and the political establishment need to understand the way Iran thinks and the way the Islamic Republic thinks. That they have to respect some of its basic red lines. That the Islamic Republic is not the fragile house of cards that it always thinks it is. Iran is not that simple. I think what the Islamic Republic should understand, is that sometimes there's a tendency to overplay its hand. That when the United States says it's serious about negotiations, it's serious about negotiations, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it plays games. Yes, I know, but that they should not play too much of this reluctant bride during moments like this.
I know, scientifically speaking, it is impossible to predict the future, but there are some variables and there are some elements that you can put together in order to have a better understanding of what might happen in future, in different scenarios. What is the most probable scenario that you can imagine, first? Second, I want to know, how do you evaluate Iran's political behavior overall in these tensions between Iran and America, in nuclear tensions, Iran and Israel, the relations between Iran and Arab states in southern part of the Persian Gulf, in a very big picture, how to evaluate Iran's political and foreign policy behavior? Thank you. These are two questions, actually.
I wouldn't know where to even begin laying out the chessboard in terms of what's the most probable outcome in the coming months or years. But I would say the safest prediction I could make is that we kind of continue the way we have for the past 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. I mean, where there is a kind of low-grade Cold War between Iran and the West, and that the Islamic Republic survives. There is the other scenario that I mentioned, which fills me with horror, which is that the possibility of the sort of a civil war being provoked from the outside. I worry about that. I really do, because that's a possibility, and I think Iranians, like any people anywhere in the world, could easily get sucked into something like that. There's a logic that takes place when these things start to happen and people start killing each other. That's the one I worry about the most. To me, it's the second most likely scenario. But to me, the most likely is just we go back to back to the way things always have been. No war, no peace. And just a lot of strategic positioning, constantly by the US, by Israel, by Iran, by other regional actors, as other international actors, Russia, China. In terms of evaluating Iran's overall policy, regionally and otherwise and internationally, I think it's a very, very, it's a policy that very much follows kind of traditional kind of raison d'etat, political philosophies. It's not different from the way I think the Shah's regime would be handling the exact same situation if it found itself in opposition to the United States. That's the key, in opposition to the United States. That's the Shah's regime, of course, had a very different relationship with the United States. But if we can bring ourselves to imagine a world in which somehow the Shah and the United States became mortal enemies, I think he would be acting the exact same way. I think this is the Islamic Republic is acting in its interests and in the interests of what it sees as the Iranian state. Now, of course, the Iranian public might have different ideas, but those ideas, the Islamic Republic decided a long time ago that to allow room for some of those ideas is potentially dangerous and can get taken advantage of by external powers and lead to destabilization and velvet revolutions and color revolutions and things like that. So this is where we are. And I see no change in the American attitude to Iran, either under Democrats or Republicans, unless there is a Democratic president that is very different. Bernie Sanders, who's too old, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez type of president, real, kind of radical out of nowhere, Zohran Mamdani kind of president. But I don't see someone like that winning an election in the United States. So, yeah.
Thank you. And is there anything that I didn't mention and you would like to refer to?
No, I mean, there's so much we could say, but I just want to answer your questions and give you whatever. I hope this has been useful for you.
Thanks a lot indeed, John.
هفته صبح رسانه‌ای برای زندگی.